There are many ways that European colonialism changed the world, but the most obvious is the huge number of lives that were lost in the name of growth and expansion. People in the West wanted to find resources, make money, save the uncivilized, and gain prestige. But in the end, it caused death, hardship, and violence for those who got it. Many of the lessons that should have been learned from colonialism seem to still not have been learned. The effects of colonialism can still be felt today, from murder to resource exploitation to loss of cultural identity. Remember that these are just a few of the worst things that happened during European empire. Oh, the terrible, sad, and painful Atlantic slave trade. That's a story for another time. The Belgian Congo, 1885-1908. In 1885, King Leopold II of Belgium took over a lot of Central Africa. He said he would make the Congo Free State more civilized and advanced. King Leopold, on the other hand, took advantage of the land and the people to get ivory, rubber, and wood. King Leopold wanted to show the rest of the world that his small country could be as strong as the big ones in Europe. Rubber brought Leopold a lot of money, and he personally ran most of the Congo until 1908. In the late 1880s and early 1890s, more bicycles and cars were being made, which raised the need for rubber, which Leopold gladly met. Africans were made to work for him. They were supervised by a rubber agent who sent them to the forest in groups and held their wives and children hostage. When the Africans didn't make their quota, they were punished harshly, usually by being flogged. As the need for rubber grew, men had to go deeper into the forest to find mature rubber vines. The Belgians also used slaves to cut down trees and make roads. Men worked so hard that they died. Their families went hungry, and many Africans ran away to the forest to resist. Leopold's men, who were part of a private military group called Force Publique, would just go after them and kill or cut off their hands or genitalia to scare them and make them behave better. After firing a bullet, the Belgian troops were told not to waste it and were told to bring back one hand. After a village rebelled, one FP officer said, "The commanding officer ordered us to cut off the heads of the men and hang them on the village palisades, also their sexual members, and to hang the women and the children on the palisade in the form of a cross. If a soldier didn't have a hand, he would either buy one, trade for one, or cut off the hand of a live person to become his boss." Whole towns were destroyed, and women were abused while their husbands collected rubber. When people from outside the area realized what was going on, they begged Leopold to stop. For example, when George Washington William went to the Congo in 1890, he wrote Leopold a letter asking why there wasn't any civilizing, meaning spreading Christianity, going on and accusing him of being violent. He said that the Belgians were excessively cruel to its prisoners, sending them to the chain gang for the smallest offenses. This kind of government cannot be seen in any other country, civilized or not. Often, these ox chains eat into inmates' necks and leave sores that flies hover around, making the wound worse. This makes the prisoner worry all the time. A shikot, which is a dried piece of hippopotamus skin, is often used to beat the people. When it is put on well, blood usually flows at every stroke. But the horrible things that happen to troops and workers are nothing compared to what the poor natives go through when they are thrown into these terrible prisons here in the upper river for no reason at all. Because of anger around the world over the conditions in the Congo Free State, the Belgian government took over the colony in 1908 and changed its name to the Belgian Congo. Leopold was in charge of the Congo Free State and is said to have made $100 million to $500 million. However, up to 10 million Africans died during his rule. British India and the Famines, 1865-1943. To be clear, India, which at the time included what are now Bangladesh and Pakistan, went through many famines when it was ruled by the British East India Company and the British government. Many historians disagree on what part the British played in the famines, but most agree that the British policies, actions, and reactions during each of the famines made more people die. In 1865, there was a famine in Orissa, but the British government decided to ignore it until the British troops started to go hungry. India got rice and other supplies from the British in 1866, but it was too late for many people. Because of this, 1/3 of the people in Orissa died. The British also had the same attitude toward food when 4 to 5 million Indians died during the famine in Madras in 1876 and 1878. During the famines in India in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the British continued to send food to other parts of the empire, but did nothing to help the people of India. These days, the famine of 1943 is getting more notice around the world than the others. During World War II, the British exported more than 70,000 tons of rice between January and July 1943, which was enough food to feed almost 500,000 people. Parents dumped their starving children into rivers and wells because things were so bad. A lot of them killed themselves by jumping in front of trains. People who were hungry begged for the water that had been used to boil the rice. Kids ate grass, yam roots, leaves, and vines. Up to 3.5 million people died during the Bengal famine in 1943. Spain, the Aztecs, and Tenochtitlan, 1519–1521. In the early 1600s, Spanish conquistadors came into touch with the Aztec Empire, which was based in Tenochtitlan and controlled most of modern-day Mexico. When Hernán Cortés arrived in 1519, things quickly turned violent. Once Montezuma II, the king of the Aztecs, heard that Cortés had landed, he sent him gifts in the hopes that they would go back to Cuba, which Spain already ruled with Cortés's help. Cortés burned the other ships so that his men would have to march to Tenochtitlan to get the wealth. Cortés got support from people who were against Montezuma before he got to the Aztec capital. For example, 3,000 Tlaxcalteca men told him to take over the city of Cholula. Cortés destroyed the city, burning it to the ground, and according to his letters, in 3 hours' time his troops killed 3,000 people and burned the city. Another witness, Vasquez de Tapia, claimed the death toll was as high as 30,000. Cortés went on to Tenochtitlan, where on November 9th, 1519, he met Montezuma face to face. People greeted him with gifts and cheers, but Montezuma and his people were afraid of the Spaniards, especially after hearing about the massacre at Cholula. They were homes for Spanish people, like Cortés, who many people thought was the god Quetzalcoatl. In the following week, Cortés betrayed his host by seizing Montezuma on November 16th and making him openly submit to the King of Spain. Cortés made Montezuma look weak, and the nobles of the Aztecs got rid of him, rebelling against both their king and the Spanish. In several fights, Tenochtitlan was taken by both the Aztecs and the Spanish. In August 1521, the Spanish finally took it for themselves. By that time, the Spanish had starved the Aztecs and spread smallpox, which killed off most of the people. According to sources, on the day that Tenochtitlan was taken, the Spaniards committed some of the most brutal acts ever inflicted upon the unfortunate people of this land. The cries of the helpless women and children were heart-rending. The Tlaxcalans and other enemies of the Aztecs revenged themselves pitilessly for old offenses and robbed them of everything they could find. Only Prince Ixtlilxochitl of Texcoco, an ally of Cortés, felt compassion for the Aztecs because they were of his own homeland. He kept his followers from maltreating the women and children as cruelly as Cortés and the Spaniards did. The anguish and bewilderment of our enemies was pitiful to behold. The warriors gathered on the rooftops and stared at the ruins of their city in a dazed silence, and the women and children and old men were all weeping. During the next few decades, the Spanish destroyed all traces of Tenochtitlan and the Aztec kingdom by building New Spain on top of them. As of 1568, only 3 million of the 30 million Aztecs who lived there in 1518 were still alive. The huge number of deaths was mostly due to sickness, fighting, and not having enough food. Boer concentration camps, 1900–1902. There were 2 Boer wars in South Africa. The first one happened in the 1870s and 1880s, and the second one happened from 1899 to 1902. During the Second Boer War, which was also called the South African War, British troops captured Boers, who were Dutch and African, and put them in camps. What did the Boers do? Boers, which is the Dutch and Afrikaans word for farmer, lived in the Transvaal and Orange Free States, which are just north of South Africa, which was ruled by the British. The British were afraid that the Boers would try to take over all of South Africa when Transvaal and the Orange Free State joined forces in 1897. So that wouldn't happen, the British put troops on the line between British South Africa and the Boer states. In 1899, the Boers gave the British one last chance to get rid of their troops. The British refused, and in October 1899, war broke out. For the first 6 months of the war, the Boers were victorious, but the British had more guns and more people. The almost 90,000 Boer soldiers were no match for the 500,000 British soldiers. By 1900, the British had taken over both of the cities of the Boer republics and added the land to their own. Due to a rise in Boer activity, the war went on until early 1902. However, with the Peace of Vereeniging, the Boers were forced to accept British rule. During the South African War, 100,000 British soldiers and 14,000 Boer soldiers were killed in battle. The war's biggest death toll, though, came from the concentration camps that the British set up. The British took men, women, and children from the countryside of South Africa and put them in camps in both Boer republics. This was mostly done to try to stop guerrilla fighting. In September 1901, there were 34 camps with about $110,000 white Boers. As one tourist put it, the camps were terrible. The exile camp here is a good 2 miles from the town, dumped down on the southern slope of a kopje, a small rocky hill, right out in the bare brown veld, with not a tree in sight and no shade of any kind. Around 2,000 to 3,000 people died every month in some camps. By the end of the war, almost 27,000 men, women, and children had died because of how they were treated. This made up 15% of all the Boers living in both countries. There were also camps for black people, but they didn't make as much of a fuss as the camps for white people. Around 14,000 to 20,000 black people died in the British camps. Mau Mau Uprising, 1952-1960. During the 1930s and 1940s, when Britain ruled Kenya, the native Kikuyu tribe kept losing land and the right to farm it. The tribe stayed loyal to the British government, but there were growing opposition movements in Kenya. By 1952, a secret group called the Mau Mau was attacking the British. The British banned the Mau Mau, but they kept getting more members and causing so much trouble and bloodshed that they had to declare a state of emergency in 1952. Notable nationalists like Jomo Kenyatta, who would become president of Kenya, were in the Mau Mau. But after the state of emergency was announced, many of the group's members were arrested. This only made the Mau Mau commit more violent crimes against both British and Kikuyu people. Even though the British sent more and more men to Kenya, the Mau Maus kept attacking for another 8 years. The British began to do sweeps and capture both suspected and real Mau Mau members. They also used collective punishment on towns they thought were hiding Mau Mau members or were supporting the group. There were thousands of Kikuyu and people thought to be Mau Mau who were taken and sent to reservations or camps, where abuse and torture was commonplace, as British guards used beatings, sexual abuse, and executions to extract information from prisoners and to force them to renounce their allegiance to the anti-colonial cause. There is disagreement about how many Mau Mau were killed during this time. The official number is $11,000, which includes 1,090 prisoners shot by the British government. During the 8 years of emergency, only 32 white farmers were killed. According to the Kenyan Human Rights Commission, however, 90,000 Kenyans were executed, tortured, or maimed during the crackdown, and 160,000 were detained in appalling conditions. Spain and the Incas, 1532-1572. In 1531, Spanish conquistadors Francisco Pizarro and Diego de Almagro came to what is now Peru and found a society in trouble. There had been a civil war between Huáscar and Atahualpa over who should lead the kingdom. The Inca were coming off of that. Even though Atahualpa won, he and his people still had problems with fighting among themselves. Aside from the fight for power, there were also smaller tribes in the Inca kingdom that didn't like being ruled by the Incas. With 80,000 men behind him, Pizarro met Atahualpa in November 1532. The meeting was calm, but both men planned to kill the other the next time they saw each other. Pizarro struck the Inca the next day and killed 7,000 men while holding Atahualpa hostage. The Spanish had a lot more weapons than the Incas, who only had spears and arrows and didn't lose any soldiers in the fight. Over the next 8 months, the Inca gathered silver, gold, jewels, and other valuable things to make their captors happy. It's not clear if Atahualpa tried to sell himself or if the Spanish offered to let him go in exchange for money. The Spanish happily took all of the rewards, but in the summer of 1533, they put Atahualpa to death. He was supposed to be burned at the stake, but he was gagged instead after he and the Inca decided to become Christians. When Atahualpa died, the Inca didn't have a head, which made them even easier for the Spanish to take over. Over the next 40 years, the Spanish slowly took over every Inca city and stronghold. In 1572, they took full control of the empire, even though locals were still fighting in small groups. Overall, the Spanish presence in the New World caused a lot of deaths through smallpox and other diseases that spread quickly, as well as through war, especially when the Inca kept rebelling against them. In the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the Spanish killed between 50 and 90% of the people who lived in the Andes mountain area of South America. The British and Australian Aboriginal massacres, 1790s, 1890s. Between the late 1700s and early 1800s, people from both the Netherlands and Great Britain came to Australia to settle. However, only the British stayed and chose to colonize the island. When British ships came to New South Wales in 1788 to start a settlement, they got along well with the native Aboriginal people at first. Aboriginal people's lives were getting more and more messed up by Europeans, so resistance groups formed. Britain, on the other hand, kept using New South Wales as a prison colony, moving groups of criminals to the edges of the empire to get rid of them. From 1788 to 1823, most British people who came to Australia were criminals or sailors. Starting in 1793, though, free settlers began to come. Several groups of Aboriginal people were killed by British troops in the New South Wales area in the 1810s, 1820s, and 1830s. In 1816, 14 Aboriginal people were killed at Appin after they crossed into British territory in search of food. Between 50 and 100 innocent Australian natives were killed at the Waterloo Creek Massacre and the Mile Creek Massacre of the Kamilaroi people in 1838. A very hard year. The British slowly started to explore and take over more of the island. When they came across Aboriginal groups, they killed more of them. In Victoria, between 60 and 200 Aboriginal people were killed at Portland in 1833 and 1834. 20,000 Kurnai lived in Gippsland in 1840. By 1853, there were only 131 left, and by 1857, there were only 96. Even though no one says they all died brutally, it's likely that hundreds did. The 1830s in Western Australia saw harsh raids against Aborigines who were thought to be stealing chickens. This was because the daring and hostile conduct of the natives induced me, Captain Irwin, to seize the opportunity to make them sensible to our superiority by showing how severely we could retaliate their aggression. The exact number of attacks and killings by the British in Australia against the Aborigines is unknown, but it is thought to be quite high. But not all of these deaths were due to fighting. It was easy to get sick, and because the native groups didn't have any defenses, a lot of them died. There were 750,000 Aboriginal people living in Australia when the British first came there. That number had dropped by 90% by 1920. A lot of Aboriginal people were killed, and others were taken from their homes and put to work on farms. They had to deal with difficult conditions and didn't have any freedom. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, it was standard practice for British authorities to take Aboriginal children and place them with Europeans to watch over them. This meant that thousands of young Aboriginal people were taken from their homes. About 10 to 30% of all Aboriginal youth were taught in a way that was based on European ideas. They were also given new names and told or even forced to give up their native languages and customs. French Algeria, 1954-1962. As the French lost control of their colonies around the world, they tightened their control over Algeria. Algeria was taken over by France in 1830 after Ottoman rule failed, and a lot of French settlers, known as Pieds Noirs, moved to the North African land. After 1848, the French thought of Algeria as part of France. When settlers took over land, many farmers and peasants were forced to move to poor areas. By the 1870s, about 1/3 of the original Algerian people had died from disease, starvation, and early resistance. Algerians sometimes fought back against the French, but the large number of European settlers made things more difficult for everyone and led to the rise of a resistance movement in the early 1900s. In 1945, there were a number of peaceful protests in Algeria. The people were celebrating their win over Germany in the war and also wanted independence. The French responded with violence. During the May 1945 protests in Sétif and Guelma, French troops fired on the protesters and kept up their harsh actions for several days. There are different counts, but according to the Algerian state, left 45,000 people dead. European historians put the figure at between 15,000 and 20,000. Algerians fought back against French colonization, which finally led to war between the natives and the French. The different groups in Algeria that wanted the French to leave formed the Front de Libération Nationale in 1954. They fought a war for independence until 1962 with the Armée de Libération Nationale. The French bombed Algeria and razed towns and villages by arresting people, torturing them, and bombing them during the Algerian War for Independence. People were tortured by burning, electrocuting, torturing them with water, and hitting them. An ex-French general named Paul Ausseresses said, "Only rarely were the prisoners we questioned during the night still alive the next morning. Whether they had talked or not, they had generally been neutralized." Estimates for the numbers of Algerians killed during the war vary from 90,000 to 1.5 million. French Haiti, 1790s-1804. In Haiti in the late 1700s, slaves and gens de couleur, or free people of color, worked together to fight French colonial rule. From 1791 onward, hundreds of French settlers were killed by slave revolts and attacks on plantations by Maroons, who were slaves who had run away and were hiding. This made the French troops respond violently and harshly. There were many horrible things that French troops did in August 1791. They killed 6 blacks who were chained up in the hospital and 2 who were completely blameless, as well as the 50 shot in trenches prepared in the town cemetery, and the 20 black brigands who had been captured, put on a boat, and drowned in the sea. By the end of 1791, Toussaint Louverture had become the leader of the rebel army. In 1794, the French had to end slavery in the colonies. It seemed like Louverture was on the side of the French, but he kept working for his own government and rule in Haiti. In 1801, Napoleon Bonaparte sent French troops back to Haiti to sort things out like they were before. This caused another war. Even worse, fighting broke out between the two sides. Black people killed settlers and any white people they could find. The French set up a ship as a mass murder machine. Black people were pushed down into the hold and suffocated by poisonous fumes. The ship's name is the Stifler. On January 1st, 1804, Haiti was declared a free state. The goal of the slave revolt was reached, but 400,000 people died during the Haitian slave revolt as a whole. Most of them were slaves or other Haitians. Louverture, on the other hand, was caught in 1802 and sent to France, where he died the next year. He never found out that the revolt he had been so active in had been successful in the end. German Namibia and the Herero genocide, 1904-1907. Germany owned a lot of land in Africa, including what is now Namibia, which was called Southwest Africa back then. After the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885, which gave Africa to different European countries, Germany took over Namibia, negotiated its borders with Angola, which was controlled by Portugal, and made plans with Britain to allow Germany passage to the Zambezi River in the east. Germans started taking land and cattle from the local Herero and Nama people in 1890. In the 1890s and early 1900s, there were uprisings against German rule. In 1903, German troops and local groups fought a battle. When Herero groups refused to move to areas, both sides started to move toward war. One Nama chief was shot in a fight over a goat. In early 1904, 100 Germans were killed by African troops. At first, the Africans had more soldiers than the Europeans, but by August, the Germans were ahead. Germany then moved the Herero and Nama groups to reservations and camps over the next 2 years. Lots of prisoners of war in the camps were used as slave labor to build railways, docks, and buildings throughout the country. Germany gave orders to kill everyone, which were explained by Lieutenant General Lothar von Trotha, who was in charge of the colonies. The Herero people will have to leave the country. If the people refuse, I will force them with cannons to do so. Within the German boundaries, every Herero, with or without firearms, with or without cattle, will be shot. I won't accommodate women and children anymore. I shall drive them back to their people, or I shall give the order to shoot at them. Germany and the Nama were at war until 1907, during which time 65,000 to 80,000 Herero lives and around 10,000 Nama lives had been lost. This made up about 80% of their total population. Dutch East Indies, 1945-1949. In the 1600s, the Dutch trade empire included the islands of Sumatra, Java, and parts of Borneo. These were called the Dutch East Indies. In 1602, the Dutch set up the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, or VOC, also known as the Dutch East India Trading Company, to control the spice trade in the area between the Indian and Pacific Seas. In 1600, the British started their own trading company called the British East India Company. The Portuguese, who were already losing power by the late 1600s, were their main rivals. In 1619, the VOC set up its business headquarters in Batavia, now Jakarta, East Indies. The company controlled trade in the area until it went bankrupt in 1799. After that, the Dutch government took over and changed the names of the islands to the Dutch East Indies. Through the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries, the Dutch controlled the East Indies until Japan took them over during World War II. The Dutch East Indies didn't want to be ruled by the Dutch again after the war finished, so they started a war for independence. In 1945, the Dutch East Indies, which would later become Indonesia, came out on its own. The Dutch and the other Allied powers didn't believe the story, so troops were sent to Indonesia to take it back under English control. Between 1945 and 1946, battles showed how strong and dedicated the Indonesian military was to the cause. As a result, there were several attempts to make peace. The government of Indonesia, which had just become independent, had a hard time getting started, but they were still able to stop the Dutch when peace talks broke down in 1947. In the 2 months that the Dutch fought to take over Sulawesi in 1946 and 1947, they killed about 4,000 Indonesians, led by Captain Raymond Westerling, who used what would become known as the Westerling method. The Dutch commandos would surround a village during pre-dawn hours, searching the residents and their homes. Anyone found with a weapon was shot on the spot and his house burned. The rest were herded into an open field, the men separated from the women and children. Any suspected terrorists were brought forward, condemned, and summarily executed. The worst retaliations of the war happened in the Netherlands after police action began in 1947. The Dutch sent 120,000 troops to Indonesia to keep peace and order during 2 big police actions. As one former soldier put it, I didn't shoot them, the Indonesians, but I tortured and beat them up. They fell over when I put them out in the sun. I wasn't told to do it. You get used to it over time. Isn't it awful? I tortured people on my own, not because they told me to. I meant to do a good job. Indonesia became its own country in 1949, but it's hard to say how many people died during that time. The Dutch suffered 6,000 deaths as a direct result of war. Indonesian casualties are almost impossible to calculate. Irish Potato Famine, 1846-1852. During the Irish Potato Famine in the middle of the 1800s, about 1 million people, or up to 25% of the Irish population, died of hunger or illness. Another million people had to leave Ireland or were kicked out. These famines, like the ones in India, were not caused by the British Empire. However, British policies and actions made them worse and killed more people than they should have. In this time period, Ireland was part of the British Empire. When the potato blight first showed up in 1845, England didn't do much to help. In Ireland, potatoes were the main food. It is now known that a plant pathogen caused the crop failures of the 1840s. These failures robbed the Irish of food, feed for their cattle, and a good to sell abroad. Queen Victoria got rid of the corn and grain rules that made food in Ireland more expensive than potatoes. She also started shipping grain and corn to the country, but most people couldn't afford it, there wasn't enough, and many didn't know how to cook the new foods. People were being kicked out of their homes because they were poor, so owners started setting up charity houses and workhouses all over the country. During the famine, Ireland continued to send a lot of goods out of the country, which fed people all over the world at the cost of Irish men and women. Along with ending help programs like soup kitchens, the British government took a laissez-faire stance and waited for the economic and social problems to get better on their own. Amritsar Massacre, 1919. With the start of the Raj in 1858, the British Empire took direct control of India. When the 1800s and early 1900s came around, England put a governor-general, also known as a viceroy, in Calcutta and ran India from London. England kept hiring Indians for lower-level government jobs, but the rise of Indian nationalism and the rising cost of running the kingdom led to more Indians taking control of their own lives after World War I. Following the end of World War I, Indian calls for freedom got louder and sometimes even got violent. Indians fought with the British and gave them resources and men, but they didn't have a say. There were protests by nationalists, and the British started to ban public meetings. Thousands of people went to a Sikh religious gathering in the town of Amritsar on April 13, 1919, even though they were aware that it was illegal to gather in public. At the same time as the religious holiday, there was a nationalist protest in Amritsar, where British troops were stationed. Without any reason, British soldiers started fire on the Indians who were not armed, killing hundreds and hurting over 1,000. Accounts of the killing at Amritsar say that British Brigadier General Reginald Dyer and 90 of his men, all of whom were Indian, fired all of their guns into the crowd of Indian protesters and festival-goers for 10 minutes, firing about 1,650 rounds. The official number of deaths was 379. We hope you liked this video, subscribe to the channel if you're a history addict, and please let us know about what civilization or time period we should talk about. Also, watch another video here.